Hello YouTubers, how are you today? I just got done watching James White criticizing Harold Camping's allegorical style of biblical interpretation. And though I agree with Mr. White's assessment of Mr. Camping, I found it rather humorous that Mr. White is pretty much doing what Camping is in regards to Mr. White's belief in the 5 points of Calvinism. Mr. White chides Camping for allegedly having some knowledge that no one else has, and that to Camping, the scriptures don't mean what they plainly say. Well, isn't that what 5-pointers do? To them, God did not so love the world. To them, it should read, God so loved the elect. And to them, the Lord had laid on him the iniquity, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all, should read, and the Lord had laid on him the iniquities of only the elect. It seems that 5-pointers think that the scriptures were given to be only understood by folks with masters and PhDs in theology, and not the common man. Well, I reject that notion. In this commentary, I want to focus on what I believe to be inherently dangerous in the 5 points of Calvinism. First of all, this teaching can lead to attitudes like the one expressed by Calvinist John Ryland when he heard the famous missionary William Carey talking about becoming a missionary to India. And he told him, "Sit down, young man. When God decides to save the heathen, he will do it without your help." Unquote. And if the doctrine of irresistible grace were true, Ryland would have been correct in his assessment. For why would we need evangelism at all if all that was necessary was for God to zap all of those he wanted saved with his alleged irresistible grace? It wouldn't make much sense, would it? And think of all those who would have not benefited from Carey's presence had this great missionary listened to Ryland. Now, what makes more sense is what we find in James 5:20, and I quote, "My brethren, if any among you strays from the truth, and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins." Unquote. So contrary to the teachings of Calvinism, man does play a part in salvation. Another thing that disturbs me about Calvinism is that this doctrine of irresistible grace also can lead one to believe that Christ was not God. John Wolverd of the Dallas Theological Seminary has pointed out the following, and I quote, "In a final lament over the city of Jerusalem, Jesus stated his desire for that nation. He longed to gather the nation much as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. The nation, unlike chicks that naturally run to their mother hen in times of danger, willfully refused to turn to the Lord. They were responsible to make a choice, and their choice brought condemnation." Unquote. Now, this being true leads one to ask, if Christ was God and knew about this so-called irresistible grace, then why would he lament at all? After all, it would be his fault that he didn't apply the so-called irresistible grace upon Jerusalem. So then you can see how this can lead one to say, hey, since Christ was unaware of the so-called irresistible grace, then he was not God. In Acts 7:51, we read, "Ye stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, you do always resist the Holy Ghost, as your fathers did, so do ye." Unquote. I wonder what 5 pointers do with this verse in regards to that so-called irresistible grace. Okay, let's go on to my next point. According to the 5 pointers, unregenerate man is totally depraved. If that were the case, the world would be in total chaos, with men like these as those representing the norm, as opposed to being exceptions, which they were and are. Do you recognize these organizations? Do you think that the majority of the people who volunteer to work for these are totally depraved? Surely 5 pointers don't expect us to believe that all these volunteers are born-again Christians, do they? Oddly enough, John Piper, who is a 5 pointer, he wrote a book called Tulip, which had this to say, and I quote, "There is no doubt that man could perform more evil acts towards his fellow man than he already does. But if he is restrained from performing more evil acts by motives that are not owing to his glad submission to God, then even his virtue is evil in the sight of God." Unquote. So even Piper admits that man can have a virtue of his own. And the reason is that this is true because man is made in the image of God. And though he can be dead in trespasses, he still has the capability to understand what was right and wrong and is able to make choices. And this is verified in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, and I quote, "Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." Unquote.